Our first panel, The Cost of Authoritarianism, Assessing U.S. Middle East Policy Over the Long Term. It's an honor to have joining us today, this morning, Dr. Sarah Lee Whitson, who's the Executive Director of DAWN, Whitson, the CEO of Engage, Ismail Numan, who is the Vice President and North African Studies Coordinator for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and Dr. Shadi Hamid, a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institutions. Their bio is in the booklet, and I will please invite Dr. Sarah Lee Whitson to join us. Thank you.
So it's not glaring right in my eyes. Some technical problems here until I get the Wi-Fi to work. Thank you for your patience as I stand up here, and for the record, I'm not a doctor, but I'm just a lawyer, which is a plus or minus in some people's books. I wanted to reflect and observe on how one U.S. administration after another has signaled big plans for a new foreign policy centered on a pivot to Asia, which would be made possible by a withdrawal from the Middle East, only to find itself pulled more deeply into the region militarily, politically, and economically. What I've called from withdrawal to full-service shop. And I want to review the Biden administration's early promises to center human rights, withdraw, and then evaluate its new approach, articulated most recently by Jake Sullivan, which I think marks the final and complete abandonment of any notions of a recalibration of U.S. relationships with dictatorships, much less a promotion of democracy in the Middle East. And I think that even framing the conversation as one of the United States promoting democracy in the Middle East, whether or not it should, really hides the reality of the United States promoting dictatorship and autocracy in the Middle East. The Biden administration took some important steps in that direction of its withdrawal and pivot, most notably and importantly withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan, which the American public overwhelmingly supported, despite withering criticism from the blob, disappointed to see any war end. It also moved to withdraw some U.S. Patriot missiles that President Trump had moved into Saudi Arabia and suspended some arms transfers to Saudi and the UAE as part of its plan to recalibrate its relationship with abusive Gulf governments. It refused to go to war against the Houthis in Iran following the January 2022 drone attacks on a UAE fuel depot. This following on the Trump administration's refusal to go to war against Iran following the 2019 drone attack on Saudi facilities in Abu Qaq was cited as, aha, it's happening, they're abandoning the Middle East, it's an abandonment of Saudi and UAE and our allies in the Middle East and so forth. But in reality, I think the factual record demonstrates only the failure of any administration, including the Biden administration, to carry out its plans to withdraw, matched only by the record of failed promises to prioritize human rights and foreign policies in the Middle East. I think by any measure of a country's security exposure and commitments, characterized by the presence of military troops and bases in the region, kinetic engagement in armed conflicts, arms transfers, and political, military, and security protection for the regimes in the region, the United States remains the unmatched Goliath in the Middle East, exceeding the cumulative exposures and commitments of every other government in the world combined. The The Biden administration, like others before it, certainly may have had a belief that reducing these commitments best served the interests of the American people, possibly served human rights of people in the region, and at the start of its administration, arrived with vigorous promises to end arms sales to Saudi, wrap up the war in Afghanistan, and continued support for the war in Yemen, reduce the exposure of US troops in the region, and even end the blank checks for dictators. But they failed to meaningfully execute on this promised recalibration, and instead we find the Biden administration rather desperately trying to amplify its relevance and influence in the region, in a new, very multipolar region, with expanded political, military, and economic support for the regimes. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a speech to the Washington Institute on May 3, clarifying the administration's new, updated priorities for a stable, integrated, and prosperous region, identifying the 5 fist bump pillars. And I'm going to really dive into those a little bit here today. Partnerships, deterrence, diplomacy, de-escalation, integration, and last and certainly least, values, which I think is really a full-throttled manifesto designed to put a nail on the coffin of any talk of a pivot from the Middle East. Omitted entirely from the pillars is even a mention of the Biden administration's claimed national security interest in preserving, promoting, and protecting democracies against authoritarianism, which of course has been emphasized in the administration's 2 series of democracy summits. The word democracy appears nowhere in the Sullivan pillars other than to describe our own imperfect government. And as for human rights, Sullivan assures that the Biden administration will raise concerns. But taken together, I think the Sullivan pillars describe a coherent policy for the Middle East only if you exclude the flimsiest of the pillars, values. It's no accident that Sullivan's first 3 pillars, the interwoven partnerships, deterrence, and integration, reflect the long-standing American approach of seeing the region as a singular zone of countries that must be influenced and integrated within the American orbit or punished and deterred as enemies. Sullivan doesn't describe these partnerships as partnerships with democracies or countries with which we share values, thankfully. He also doesn't reference them as adhering to a rules-based order, that sort of minimal common ground which the administration sometimes falls back on, because of course that would be a false claim if the current record of unlawful invasions, occupations, and annexations in the Middle East are considered. Most significantly, he excludes any description at all of what these partners actually are: unelected tyrannical rulers and apartheid military occupation governments. Instead, Sullivan identifies the basis of these partnerships not based on who the partners are or the values or interests we share, but more transactionally based on what we want from them. I quote, diversified supply chains, number 1, clean energy, number 2, which apparently includes dirty, cheap oil, described as a stable supply of current energy, but under the clean energy bucket, and the most oddly worded of all, solutions to the demand signal from countries that are getting entreaties from some of our great power competitors, apparently referencing the reverse leverage of giving our partners the quote-unquote solutions they want, weapons and security, in return for keeping China and Russia out. Excluded from any scrutiny, as usual, is what Israel provides in this transactional partnership framework, because Israel is a special partner for which our unconditional, ironclad commitment may never be questioned, and whose, quote, freedom of action, which means to start a war with Iran to prevent it from acquiring a nuclear weapon, Sullivan reasserts. The otherwise beloved international rule-based order be damned. Sullivan claims that expanding and enhancing the integration of the Middle East partners with each other will, quote, empower them, advance regional peace and security, and reduce the resource demands on the US. The elements of integration include not only military, economic, and trade integration, but also, I quote, the final complete integration of Israel into the region and the world via the Abraham Accords, all spearheaded and prioritized by the United States. While it's true that expanding the military and economic integration of these authoritarian governments will indeed make them more powerful, Sullivan doesn't tell us why we should want to strengthen them, particularly in the context of the existential battle between democracies and tyrannies that the Biden administration has declared. I think what's far more debatable is the notion that empowering such an axis of authoritarian regimes will bring peace and prosperity. It's a problematic point of view given the Biden administration's argument that peace and prosperity are within the unique provenance of liberal democracies. I mean, after all, if authoritarian abusive regimes can deliver peace and prosperity, what exactly is it we've got over China? It's also problematic, as a matter of fact, given that Biden's Middle East partners remain key sources of violence, war, corruption, and tyranny in the region, which I think is hardly a recipe for peace or prosperity, particularly if one excludes the random geographic gift of oil. Sullivan's emphasis on demands, alluding to the notion that increased military integration by the Middle East partners will make them feel more secure, better protected, and therefore less reliant on U.S. military resources, is no less contentious. The Biden administration may well wish to reduce the presence of human military resources, i.e. troops in the region, and temper demands that the U.S. use its muscle to support the regimes in their endless conflicts. But there's no evidence that the U.S. wishes to reduce its weapons sales to the region. It's hard not to see at least an outcome, if not the goal, of military integration under a U.S. umbrella being the deepened and expanded reliance of countries under its protection, particularly in terms of needed American supervision, coordination, interoperable weapons, supplies, and training, making it harder for any of them to break away from U.S. influence and control. And while the record shows that Saudi, the UAE, and Egypt are diversifying their weapons purchases and business deals, specifically with China and Russia, they're not reducing their demands for U.S. military protection. The contrary seems to be true, as Saudi and the UAE are demanding unprecedented bilateral security guarantees, NATO-level security guarantees from the United States. An updated assessment of the state of bilateral influence and leverage in 2023 would recognize that the buyers are the ones calling the shots with the Biden administration. That's why we see Sullivan gently and cryptically citing merely policy changes in arms sales when referring to the brief cuts in sales to Saudi Arabia, when extolling the Biden administration's early efforts to end the Yemen war. I think the most arrogant and patronizing of Sullivan's remarks, reflective of the Biden administration policy, mimicked in February by White House Middle East Coordinator Brett McGurk, is this faux humility for the administration's realpolitik framework, centered on partnerships with these authoritarian regimes and the broken promises to recalibrate its relationships with them. The administration's new realistic and pragmatic policies for the Middle East, as Sullivan describes them, are the product of a clear-eyed, almost sad acceptance that the U.S. has, I quote, been naive about what it is possible to achieve in terms of transforming societies by force or diktat, and quote, incorporating hard lessons learned to eschew grand designs or unrealistic promises of transformational change. What's so discombobulating about this argument isn't just the halo it places on past administrations for their noble, if misguided, efforts to transform the region into democratic countries that respect rights. Let's put aside debating the sincerity of U.S. Middle East policies over the past several decades. The most egregious aspect of this argument is the absolute punt on responsibility for the harms of U.S. policies predicated on partnerships with some of the world's most abusive governments. In Sullivan's view, replacing grand designs for democracy and human rights with deepened, expanded partnerships and integration with Middle East despots, those are the only two options, and apparently it's a win-win proposition because he sees no need to account for the costs of U.S. military support and political protection for these governments, enabling, encouraging, contributing to, and even profiting from the very human rights abuses about which he assures us the U.S. will continue to speak. nor does he attempt to account for the costs of these deepened partnerships to Biden's national security strategy of protecting democracies to win against our authoritarian rivals. I don't have time to discuss why the pivot failed or to review the emerging multipolarity. I think ultimately the Biden administration was unwilling to demote their long-standing interests that would be the cost of pivoting away and prioritizing human rights from support of powerful Middle East regimes, cheap oil, Israeli immunity, corporate weapons sales, and the broadest interest of all, a belief in which is an article of faith, which is U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. I do think we should be focusing on the emerging multipolar reality, which is now not only harming the people of the region, but increasingly risking American democracy as well. I hope we get to that during our discussion. Thank you.